Good afternoon, everyone. If I could call the House to some semblance of order. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and we are very fortunate today to be having a discussion, and first off, of course, a presentation of the New Rules of the Road, a progressive approach to globalization by Jared Bernstein and Lori Wallach. We are considered the pro-globalization folks, but I like to believe, in fact, I confidently believe, we're the honest pro-globalization folks. And the honest pro-globalization folks have to take seriously and engage with a variety of views as long as people are bringing forth their ideas as a means to make globalization work for all and not as pure protectionism or pure business lobbying or whatever. And there is a large community of people, many of whom in this room, who are doing that. A little over a week ago, we had current House Ways and Means Chairman Kevin Brady. Wayne Brady is a TV star. Kevin Brady talk about his vision going forward for the U.S. trade negotiations and agenda. And today, I'm grateful to Jared Bernstein for bringing to us his and Lori Wallach's approach, which obviously comes from a slightly different position. I'm going to go into the bios. Not only do we have the two authors of the report, but we have three very distinguished and I think very relevant commentators. So we are going to run this. I always try to be tight on time. We're going to run this a little more disciplinarian than we usually do, even just to make sure that everybody has their say. And then we get to open it up to the audience for discussion. Leading off, of course, will be Dr. Jared Bernstein, who's been with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities since May 2011. He was previously Chief Economist and Economic Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, Executive Director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class, and a member of President Obama's economic team. That, of course, understates his influence. Prior to serving the Obama administration, Dr. Bernstein was a senior economist and the director of the Living Standards Program at the Economic Policy Institute. He also is a star of CNBC with a frequency that my stomach could not take. So well done, Jared. Our first discussant will be Daniel Griswold, who is the Mercatus Center Senior Research Fellow at George Mason University. He's also the co-director of the program on the American Economy and Globalization at George Mason. Many of us know him from his long tenure and forthright views as Director of Trade and Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute, where he's been a valued colleague. He previously served as President of the National Association of Foreign Trade Zones. Following Daniel will be Jennifer Hillman, who is Professor of International Law at Georgetown Law Center, another member of the trade policy community and commentariat who we value highly. Ms. Hillman is not only a faculty member at the Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown, she is, although soon will be ceasing to be, a partner in the law firm of Cassidy Levy Kent. More importantly for our today's discussion, she recently completed her term as one of 7 members from around the world serving on the WTO's appellate body, and prior to that served 9 years as commissioner at the United States International Trade Commission. Her distinguished record of public service in this realm is admirable, and we're glad to have her perspective. She was also previously general counsel at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. Following Jennifer will be my predecessor, the Institute's co-founder and director emeritus, Fred Bergston. Fred was, of course, director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics from 1981 to 2012, previously Assistant Secretary of International Affairs for U.S. Treasury from 1977 to 81. Like Jared, that vastly understates his influence both in the U.S. and internationally at that time. I'm not going to go through his entire CV, but we all know Fred has been at the center of many trade negotiations and much trade legislation in the Congress through the last 4 decades. He's currently serving his second term as a member of the President's Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations, among many other roles. Finally, Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, will speak. Ms. Wallach has been the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch since 1995. She has promoted her vision of the public interest regarding globalization and international commercial agreements in many fora, including numerous testimonies before Congress, all over the press. She has a law degree and is expert on trade negotiations and trade agreements. In 93, Wallach was a founder of the Citizens Trade Campaign, a U.S. national coalition of consumer, labor, environmental, family, farm, religious, and civil groups, and she currently serves on their board. So to give this some structure, Jared is going to present the report for up to 25 minutes. Our three discussants will then each get to speak for 10 minutes, and then Lori will get to respond to the discussants for no more than 12 minutes, and that way it's sort of all balanced. And then we will have everybody up here and open it up to questions from the floor. All our thousands, I hope, of people watching on webcast or in the future, obviously the transcript, the report by Jared and Lori, and the discussion will be available on the Institute's website, and we encourage you to continue to stay engaged. But now let me turn it over to Jared. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. It's a testament to Adam, to Fred, my friend Joe Gagnon, and many other folks here at IIE that I'm even standing here and that Lori and I were invited because these are folks who are open to different viewpoints and willing to mix it up with us in ways that I think are healthy. So thank you again for the invitation. And a big shout out to my co-author Lori, who you'll hear from later. You know, you mentioned the CNBC shtick and how it would turn your stomach to do a lot of that. And I was thinking of a funny thing that happened the other day, or at least it was funny to me, where I was on CNBC and we were talking about the economy, and in the context of the election, I pointed out many things that were going well. The unemployment rate's fallen a great deal. There's been steady job creation. We're starting to see some wage growth. Last year, incomes actually went up for low and middle income folks at a very nice clip. And yet there are still great pockets of despair, no question. I didn't want to overstate it. And as I was starting to say it, the CNBC moderator said, well, Jared, you know there's two Americas out there. And I've been writing about the two Americas out there for about 30 years while these guys were, largely focusing on stock tickers, and that's fine. But it kind of elevates the extent to which these the issues that motivate Lori and I are so prominent right now. This is the outline of my talk to you for the next 20 or so minutes. I want to talk about the election and the elevation of international trade in ways that I haven't experienced for decades, maybe ever, ways that I think are both unfortunate, but also what's the old thing where I don't know if this is true, but they say in Japan the word for crisis and opportunity are the same or similar. So I think that this moment of the elevation of these issues in the context of the election presents a great opportunity for us, and it's one that Lori and I are trying to take advantage of. I think the importance of promoting globalization in the spirit that Adam said in his introductory remarks is critical. For decades, I'll argue, the costs of trade to American workers and their communities were largely ignored, but in the current debate, we risk failing to recognize some of the benefits, and that a much more balanced view needs to come out of this, both in terms of micro impacts on people, jobs, wages, communities, and on macro impacts in ways that I don't hear enough said about, and I'll get into that a bit. And then the bulk of my presentation is the proposals that Lori and I put together that make up our paper, ways in which we believe trade agreements can be recrafted to put workers and consumers and the environment more at the core of the agreements versus the desires and the privileges of investors and corporations. So we think that if we take out some bad stuff and put in some good stuff, we can help to achieve that goal. And finally, I'm going to talk about a very important, in my view, conclusion, which is that the status quo won't hold. There's absolutely no requirement, and even if I made one, you probably wouldn't pay attention to it, that you have to agree with everything that Lori and I say. But I do think that if your response is, we don't like what you said and we don't have any ideas of how to do it differently, then you may not be the friend to globalization that you like to think you are. So why now, given the current context? Why are we having this discussion now? Well, For years, I think elites from the center left to the center right paid too little attention to the costs that international competition was meting out on various workers and their communities. This is not a statement about whether trade has net benefits, whether winners can compensate losers, and if anything, it's more. If anything, its connection to trade theory it probably has more to do with factor price equalization than comparative advantage. But finally, I mean, it took a long time, given many of us and some folks in this room who I know have been working on trying to get people to pay more attention to the costs of trade, particularly imbalanced trade on our manufacturing sector and communities that depend on those jobs, high value-added jobs, have been elevated in an important way. Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders certainly brought that to the fore, and Hillary Clinton is playing a role as well. So I think the question of why now, I mean, Lori and I sort of scratch our heads and ask, well, what took so long? To me, a much more interesting question is what now? Why now? It has to do with the fact that, as I'll show you in a minute, I think that some of the evidence has become pretty compelling, evidence that has actually been presented on this stage recently. Some of the evidence of the costs of trade, invoking a more balanced view, has been compelling. And people whose voices haven't been heard for a long time are being heard, and I think that's a positive. What now is the motivation for our paper? I also think one of the reasons we're hearing about this is because trade and immigration kind of become I said sinkhole, sort of become this rubric under which everything that's going wrong for people gets placed. Income stagnation, inequality, the erosion of labor standards, institutional dysfunction, the erosion of unions, the bargaining power deficits that many workers have, particularly non-college educated workers, perceived competition with immigrants. All of that sort of gets stored under the rubric of trade in the national debate. So that's also in the current context. But the politics of trade have, I think, been pretty destructive. The non-transparency of trade agreements, pivots by candidates who say one thing and then pivot to something else. The elites essentially arguing, as I said before, well, you know, yes, you think you've been hurt by trade, but you just don't realize its benefits. And here's another trade agreement for you. It's going to be better than the last one because this one has a little bit of trade adjustment assistance in it, which many workers just call burial insurance. So the kind of elites versus those left behind has really been ripped open in the current election. And this is not just a U.S. thing, as Adam and many other folks here have written and talked about. Obviously, not only is the Brexit another piece of evidence of concerns about and fears of globalization. In that case, one view of Brexit is a plebiscite on migration. But the rise of anti-globalization movements is something we all have to take seriously. The other day, the banner headline of the Wall Street Journal was "Globalization on the Skids." The IMF just published a chapter, a very long, detailed chapter of slowing global growth. Global growth is in there, but it's slowing growth of trade, chapter 2 in the new Outlook. And so there is a real sense that we're at some kind of a turning point. I think it's very important to distinguish between trade and trade agreements, by the way. To what extent is trade versus trade agreements the problem? And here, there's just really a very, very serious conflation. I mean, we have no bilateral trade agreement with China. Pretty hard to imagine we will in my lifetime. And yet, China absolutely dominates these discussions. I won't try to imitate the way Alec Baldwin says China when he's imitating Donald Trump, but it's just pervasive in the discussion right now. But David Autor from this stage a few weeks ago presented his paper with Gordon Hanson and others on the China shock and the impact of trade with China, particularly in the 2000s, of our large and growing deficit with them as China trade penetrated communities in the U.S., and they show significant loss of manufacturing jobs and wages and incomes. Josh Bivens has done similar work, again, tapping mostly a kind of a factor price equalization dynamics that occur when we trade when we have large trade deficits with countries who have many much lower paid workers in their production sector. And meanwhile, kind of in the background of all this is this notion, yes, as long as the winners can compensate the losers, trade is a winner. Not only do the winners not compensate the losers, and that's one of the big problems that we've had, and one of the reasons we're here today is because folks who've been hurt by trade have been insufficiently helped by any kind of a safety net or trampoline to help them get back. It's not just that the winners don't compensate the losers, it's that the winners take their winnings, and in our extremely monetized political system, they further insulate and protect themselves from the losers, and argue for the kinds of policies that we argue about today, tax cuts and various types of breaks, that not only will screw the losers further, but will continue to enrich the winners. So even if you believe that the winners can compensate the losers, the extent to which they don't, and in fact build a firewall between them and the losers with their winnings, is one of the reasons we're here today, and certainly can't be ignored. If you look at the blue-collar manufacturing wage, so this is the blue line there is the manufacturing production worker wage, compensation actually, not just wages, wages plus benefits. I think you really get a feel for what we're talking about here. The other line is the trade deficit as a share of GDP. That y-axis is on the right. And so, when the trade deficit was around zero as a share of GDP, the manufacturing wage doubled from the manufacturing compensation for blue-collar workers doubled from around 12 to 24 bucks, where it's basically been ever since as the trade deficit has become large and negative. Now, you throw two lines on a graph, people think you're making a causal argument, and I don't blame you for thinking that. And in fact, there is causality in there somewhere. But I'm not at all saying that the trade deficit is determinant of every negative outcome. And in fact, we had a trade deficit that was something like, -4, -5% of GDP the last time we were at full employment at the end of the 2000s. So a trade deficit does not keep you from getting to full employment. But no less than our own Joe Gagnon has said in a presentation I recently saw, put it in his typical concise terms, trade deficits cost jobs in bad times, distort economy in good times. I think the problem with the trade deficit is not that we can't get to full employment with large trade deficits, we do, but that's often invoked bubbles. When you're at the zero lower bound on the interest rate, it's actually pretty hard to offset the trade deficit because the Federal Reserve can't do much to help you. And these bubbles have been fueled by periods of currency management, another issue that IIE's gotten very much out in front of, where some of our trading partners suppress consumption, boost savings, export those savings to us in ways that both depress growth and interest rates and labor demand here. So essentially, exporting savings, importing labor demand. And this isn't just, and leading to some pretty bubbly financial activity in the meantime. Now, this isn't just me talking. This is Ben Bernanke writing in 2005, describing the dynamics of a global savings glut. Bernanke thought it wouldn't last particularly long, but in my view and the view of others, it has, and is now embodied in capital flows that are highly volatile and often on hair triggers, such that the Federal Reserve, if you read Governor Lael Brainerd's work, has to think twice about interest rate hikes because they have to consider the impact on pulling in capital flows, exacerbating some of these macro dynamics. So these are all, I think, important economic issues with trade, much less with trade agreements. Okay, the rest of my talk is going to be devoted to, and it's a bit, if it gets a little sloggy, I apologize, but this is the kind of down in the weeds part that Lori and I really focused on. Writing the new rules of the road, okay, that put workers and consumers, so we think, and again, IIE's been in front of this, Joe, Fred, lots of folks here have written about the importance of enforceable rules on currency in a trade deal. Critical in both political terms and in policy terms, widely agreed upon. I don't think the unenforceable side agreements are sufficient. I'd say they're insufficient. I think the IMF and the WTO's statutes and rules on this that are never enforced give you a good example of the extent to which that's true. And I think the objections to putting enforceable rules in a trade agreement fall short. One objection is, well, China's not suppressing its yuan anymore. They're not suppressing their currency, so we don't have to worry about that. Well, I bring my umbrella even when it's a sunny day. That just because they or anyone else isn't suppressing now doesn't mean that they wouldn't later. And by the way, if nobody's suppressing their currency, then let's just put it in the trade deal and humor Lori and I. So I don't buy that. I think what we've heard more of lately is that enforceable rules on currency would put the Federal Reserve in the crosshair. I think that's pretty silly. I think it's unquestionably the case that monetary policy affects the value of the dollar. So does fiscal policy, by the way, and I don't think anyone's saying we shouldn't be able to do that. Simon Johnson has written I think pretty compelling stuff on this point. When you're doing domestic monetary policy, you're buying your own bonds. When you're intervening in currency markets, you're buying international assets. I don't think it's that hard to tell the difference. We think we should change the sequencing on labor and environmental standards. Globally accepted labor and environmental standards exist, but again, they lack effective enforcement and need to be strengthened. Labor standards that have been set forth in the ILO conventions, environmental standards provided by a more robust list of multi-environmental agreements should be the minimum requirement that's included in the core text of the trade agreements. I suspect there are a lot of people in this room who know this level of weedy detail. I know Lori's one of them, and she'll be happy to talk more about that later. But I think our key insight here has to do with sequencing. Joining free trade agreements and continuing trade benefits with countries like ours have to be conditioned on maintaining compliance with the kinds of terms I just stressed, the kinds of labor and environmental standards I just stressed. So that implies different sequencing has to be incorporated, should be part of these new rules of the road. If the rules are unenforced or they require a one-time check-the-box review, or if they're just an assumption that once you trade with us, you're going to meet all kinds of environmental and labor standards because that's just the sort of infectious way we are, all of that is insufficient. And it makes no difference how progressive these rules are if they're not enforced. So we think the sequencing needs to be altered so that rules are actionably in place on environmental and labor standards before we sign the deal. Tighter rules of origin, in order for the benefits of our trade agreements to flow to workers in the countries that signed the pacts, not just us, but workers in developing countries. There's got to be a playing by the rule on rules of origin that can pretty easily be gamed right now. Even under the TPP, a majority of a car's parts could come from China, but a car assembled in a TPP country would still enter the United States with the duty-free privileges that affords signatories to that trade deal. So tightening up the rules of origin, and by the way, from lots of people who have read these rules so far, that one has gotten a great deal of agreement for, we'll see if the panel is consistent with that. More logistics in these trade deals and less rent-seeking. Trade agreements should focus more on just the basic logistics of trading goods and services across borders rather than investor protections, extending patents, all the kind of rent-seeking nonsense that goes on. And this includes facilitating trade flows with rules to standardize and reduce customs paperwork. Even with tariffs as low as they are, I think the average tariff rate is something like 3%, maybe 5%. Even with average tariff rates as low as they are, only 3%, and we were just talking about this at our table, only 3% of small and medium businesses here export to any good or any country compared to about 40% of large U.S. firms. So the kind of logistical changes that would help some of these smaller exports find their way into the global supply chain should be part of these deals, not investor state protections and patent extensions and so on, which I'll now inveigh against a little bit about those because here are some things that we think should come out of the deal. So look, we understand the view that, Lori and I, we understand that absent some form of investor protections, there's a potential for suboptimal investments in developing economies where investment risk is high. I mean, I think that's common sense. But that doesn't mean you solve this with the current ISDS, or Investor State Dispute Settlement process, where investors' privileges are elevated over sovereign democracy. Trade agreements provide a backdoor under the current ISDS process, imposing extreme concepts of property rights concepts that have been repeatedly rejected by our courts and our Congress, such as the notion that government should pay regulatory takings, compensation to property owners for the right to enforce environmental or health standards and safeguards that, again, sovereign democracies have supported. You can't, the problem with the ISDS, in our view, is that it's trying to solve the weak rule of law among our trading partners by having the broad public bear the investment risk, or by changing fundamental principles of U.S. law that were democratically agreed upon. We believe that investment risk should be borne by the investors themselves. It's their skin, not everybody else's, who should be in the game. And operationally, to us, that means that institutional investors must self-insure against the risk engendered by trading with countries whose legal systems they don't trust. And maybe somewhat snarkily, I wrote that in today's innovative capital markets could handily price such insurance. And if you listen to our USDR, we never lose such a case, so it should be cheap. Just in the interest of time, I'll go to patents. I mean, on food safety, because we've actually had some interesting discussions about that. I mean, the idea on food safety and consumer product protections is simply that we need to eliminate rules in trade agreements that allow imports in that don't comply to our safety standards. So this, again, sort of relates to the ISDS discussion. Eliminate rules that allow imports in that don't comply to our safety standards so that we have to lower our standards to be in compliance with the trade deal. That needs to come out. On patents and intellectual, look, we think trade agreements should avoid protectionism. I mean, it's that simple. And rent-seeking through patent extensions and intellectual property rights. The WTO already requires signatory countries to enact patent and copyright protections, pretty strong ones in my view. Future trade agreements shouldn't limit the competition that brings down the prices of medicines, and this has been obviously a hot debate within the TPP. It's one of the reasons why Doctors Without Borders came out very strongly against the TPP, because of the expense that the extension on the patents on biologics and biosimilars would mean to the prices in developing countries who would be hard-pressed to afford life-saving drugs. And frankly, you know, for our skin in the game, we should limit the ability of government. We should not allow trade agreements to limit the ability of governments to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical firms for bulk purchases of medicine. This is something that the Center on Budget, where I work, has weighed in on because we don't want, we want the government, healthcare programs, Medicare and Medicaid, to be doing precisely that kind of negotiation. So trade agreements should certainly not limit negotiations with pharmaceuticals for bulk purchases of medicines in that regard. Adam, do you know how much time I have left? 4? Are you showing 4 fingers? 4 fingers left. 4 minutes. 4 minutes. I get you. That's great. Let me skip to process changes, because the thing about financial regulation is exactly the same as everything else I've been saying. Trade agreements shouldn't prohibit our ability to negotiate to regulate our financial markets in any ways. Again, in the spirit of preserving sovereign law. So I think the process changes are really important. From the perspective, my thinking on this is flipped. I used to believe, and I worked for the government, I worked on the Korea FTA, but I've thought about this, you know, at the time I sort of understood this idea that if you negotiate these things in public, it's going to get very gnarly very quickly. But from I just think the logic of this is undeniable, especially in the current debate. You know, from the choice of prospective trade pact, from the choice of the partners with whom we deal to the formulation of the negotiation positions to all the back and forth that goes on for years when we negotiate these agreements, the process is too secretive, it's too exclusive, it's too non-transparent. Negotiators can meet with outside interest groups, and they do, and we've probably all been part of that. But these groups are rarely allowed to see the agreement in progress and have no way of knowing whether their input is heeded. The process in the United States has actually gotten worse over time as trade documents have been subjected to national security classification codes. So it's become less transparent, while the European Union has moved largely in the other direction. You know, the argument for the current process is that where the negotiators were to be more, and this is the argument I used to believe, and this was the argument that were the negotiators to be more transparent, stakeholders and political bodies would constantly be challenging negotiators' decision, and they'd never make any progress. I think there's a logic to that. But this is clearly an untenable and undemocratic position. It's basically saying, if people or their congressional representatives knew what we were doing, they'd never leave us alone. And that's just fundamentally one of the reasons we're in the mess we're in. So look, my final point is this. We are in the midst of non-inclusive growth, so this is the inequality problem, non-inclusive growth, stagnant trends in middle class incomes and wages, slowing productivity and dysfunctional government have contributed to this moment that we're in. Do you really think the status quo can hold? Given those facts of the case, and I strongly argue that those are the facts of the case, in order to preserve the benefits of globalization, and agrees strongly with Adam to push back on the protectionist impulses, I think we need to think outside the status quo box. Let me quote, and here I'll stop here. Let me quote Danny Roderick from I think a really insightful Harvard professor on trade. Danny Roderick wrote the other day, about a week ago in the Times, "We need to rescue globalization not just from populists, but also from its cheerleaders. Globalization evangelists have done great damage to their cause, not just by underplaying the real fears and concerns on which the Trumps of the world thrive, but by overlooking the benefits of a more moderate form of globalization." You are not required to agree with Laurie and I on anything I've just said, but I will argue that it is time for a rethink. We're completely open to your ideas. Our idea here is to start the conversation, not end the conversation. And in fact, I think Adam and others will agree with me, probably the conversation on trade will never end. So thanks very much.
Jared, that was awesome. Thank you very much. And also 24 minutes, 41 seconds. But yeah, no, but more seriously, that was really wonderful, open, clean, clear, a great way to get this discussion moving forward. Let me now turn to Daniel Griswold, please.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you all coming here today. I think Dr. Bernstein is having a mellowing effect on Lori Wallach. I've never heard her say such nice things about trade expansion than she has in this paper, so keep that up. This is a stimulating paper, worthy of a serious, thoughtful response. I told Fred Bergston, for somebody like me, it's worth at least a couple cups of coffee in the morning reading their paper. I could respond point by point to a lot of things, but let me, in my less than 10 minutes, focus on what I think should be an important issue for our progressive friends, and that is the income inequality effects of trade and of their various proposals, not just on low-income people here at home, but low-income people abroad. On that theme, the paper starts, what I think currency manipulation is a rather odd issue for progressives to latch onto. They don't mention China specifically in the paper, and it's usually the prime suspect when it comes to currency manipulation. I know there have recently been two international institutions charged with pronouncing on foreign exchange rates, the IMF and Fred Bergston, who have said that the Chinese currency is no longer overvalued. It has reached fair value, and if anything, the Chinese are intervening to keep it propped up. I'm not sure who else would be the target of currency manipulation. Would it be Vietnam, the European Union with TTIP, Britain if we sign a free trade agreement with them? The paper doesn't address the difficulties of enforcing currency rates. The Treasury Department is currently free to declare a country a currency manipulator. They have not done that for over 20 years. Or the longer-term forces that tend to offset any advantages you get from artificially depreciating your currency. Nor does the paper consider the income distribution effects of currency policies. You know, if we are out there badgering other countries to strengthen their currency, that of course means, by definition, a weaker US dollar. That is, of course, of a benefit to certain exporters into the global economy, General Electric and other big players, Boeing. But that comes at the expense of tens of millions of American consumers who will pay higher prices for imports because of a lower-priced U.S. dollar, a depreciated U.S. dollar against our major trading partners. And of course, higher import prices hit poor families disproportionately because they spend a higher share of their income on such tradable goods as food, clothing, shoes. And there have been studies that have shown this. The study a few years ago by Borda and Romulus at the University of Chicago found that imports from China were a big reason why inflation was lower on basic consumer products that were important in the budgets of poor people. They determined that our trade with China alone had offset about a third of the growth of income inequality over the period of the study, even factoring in the impact on jobs. A more recent study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found a pro-poor bias in trade expansion of all 40 countries they looked at. They did the counterfactual that if you stopped all international trade, it would reduce the spending power income 28% among the richest 10%, but 63% among the poorest 10%. And they found that even a partial reduction in the cost of importing food and manufacturing had a pro-poor bias. Our highest trade barriers in the United States today are aimed at products that are made by poor people abroad and consumed by poor people here at home. We've largely achieved free trade for the stuff that's important to the richer households. But our highest tariffs are still in place for the stuff that's important to poor households. There's no urgency in this paper for getting those tariffs down. The paper exhibits a double standard on what they call the people's rights to democratically govern their own affairs. It's very protective of our right to determine our own labor and environmental standards here in the United States. But they're insistent that we threaten through trade, withholding trade benefits, that we put pressure on less developed countries to change their labor and environmental standards to be more in conformity with what we think they should be. They even want to dictate minimum wages in other countries, and they say 50% of the median wage. Well, I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. Our national minimum wage in this country is about 25% of our median wage here in the United States. Why shouldn't our trading partners be as free as we are to determine what minimum wage should be, if you have one at all? And by the way, minimum wages I don't think have that much impact on trade, in that trade-related jobs typically pay well above the median wage. In fact, one of the cruel ironies of this progressive approach to trade is that it would stifle the very forces that are increasing wages in less developed countries. The paper repeats the myth of the race to the bottom. Most outward investment from the United States doesn't go to poor countries. 80% or more goes to other rich countries. Environmental compliance is a pretty small part of the cost of production. Labor is becoming a declining share of production. Most of our industries compete not directly with less developed countries, but with producers in Japan, the EU, Canada, and other high-wage, high-standard countries. In fact, over the past 25 years, we've had quite the opposite of a race to the bottom. Since 1990, according to the World Bank, the share of the world's population living in absolute poverty is down by 2/3, from 35% to 11%. 1 billion people around the world in the last 25 years have been lifted out of the worst kind of poverty, most dramatically in East Asia, but also pretty dramatically in South Asia, some progress in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. It's not because of foreign aid. It's not because of enforceable labor rights through trade agreements. It's because of the spread of global capitalism. I kind of feel sorry for my progressive friends sometimes because they can't share fully in the joy of this achievement for mankind because they haven't contributed all that much to it, frankly. Instead, they want to throw sand in the gears of a historical trend that has done so much to lift the lot of our fellow human beings around the world. Let me just end on the negotiating process. The paper asks, who's at the table? Well, I think when it comes to trade negotiations, there should only be one party at the table representing the United States. That's the U.S. Trade Representative. That official represents the elected President of the United States, who's acting at the direction of the U.S. Congress, which is charged with our Constitution to determine U.S. trade policy. Are the negotiations secretive? Yes, at certain phases, but I don't think any more secretive than other negotiations, probably less so than other negotiations our government engages in on climate change and arms control. We know from negotiations you can't make the compromises you need to if every proposal is immediately out there for public inspection. As Jared did mention, the administration does consult with standing committees, not just industry, but labor and NGOs. And of course, the ultimate check is Congress, which is answerable to voters. You know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership text has been out there for about a year now on the internet for everybody to go through, and there is some back and forth about improving it. So let me just end with this. I think the main argument of this paper is not about process. It's about results. No matter how many clauses are added on labor and the environment, no matter how long and thorough the process is, our progressive friends are never quite satisfied. The next agreement down is never quite good enough, and we have the case with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Despite those nice words about trade in general at the beginning of the paper, the authors are still not at peace with the fact that we have more and more freedom to do business and trade with fellow human beings in other countries. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a great honor and pleasure for me to be here and a treat to follow Dan in commenting on what I would agree is a really interesting and insightful paper that I too would urge everybody to read. And I'll start by saying that I have a significant amount of agreement with a lot of the concerns that Dr. Bernstein raises in this paper over our current international economic problems, but will confess to also having a significant amount of disagreement with his prescription for how to fix it. Let me start maybe first with where I would agree. For me, I certainly would agree that there is a real reason to be very, very worried about the issue of income inequality and the degree to which economic growth and globalization more generally have not been widely shared. I certainly believe that there is very legitimate criticism, and when you think about, where is Donald Trump or other sort of gaining points, if you will, it is in, I think, raising again and again the very real concerns over that growing inequality gap. Where I guess I have some concerns with the paper is how much of the blame for the increasing gap in our inequality can be laid at the feet of trade, and I would say more particularly can be laid at the feet of trade agreements. I mean, what do trade agreements really have to do with increasing the amount of the wealth gap? Particularly, I would say, the agreements that have been negotiated in recent years, in years in which we already have a very, very low tariff rate coming into the United States. So query whether the trade agreement caused any significant shift in the amount of imports coming into the United States. Most of those agreements were much more heavily focused outwardly on gaining access to new markets. So to the extent that you think that in some way contributed to the wealth gap, it is only this notion that when you open a new door, when you've opened a new market, who walks through that new door? people with capital and people with know-how. And to the extent that you want to say those with capital and know-how are the haves, then perhaps you have given a greater opportunity for the haves, if you will, to benefit from a trade agreement. But it's not the same thing as saying you've somehow used a trade agreement to push down the have-nots. And to the extent that that's what Dr. Bernstein is arguing, to some degree, I would take a disagreement with it. Second issue that I would certainly agree with was his comments on China. And I think the evidence increasingly that China does represent something quite different and needs to be thought of differently than all of us that have grown up looking at all of these studies about trade have done. I was very appreciative of the comments about the David Otter study that is really indicating that there really is something very genuine about a China shock. And that China really is, in terms of its size, its speed, the magnitude of its willingness to subsidize major industries, has created something that the United States and the rest of the world are really having a great deal of difficulty dealing with. I mean, if you look at just one little sector of steel and you look at what China has done, China added 60 million tons of capacity every single year for over 10 years. Just to put 60 million tons of capacity into some perspective, that's the total output of the United States and Japan combined, and that's China's additive capacity in each year. So again, I do think he is right in suggesting that we need to at least adjust our thinking to take into account the very different role that China has played in the overall governing system. The third thing that I would say I would to some degree agree with and on the other hand disagree is this issue of where does labor and in the environment play. And there my reaction is that I think some of the comments are a little bit out of date. Most of our recent agreements have contained provisions on labor and the environment, and we are now beginning to see real efforts, at least trying to enforce them. I mean, if you think about the DR-CAFTA agreement, has provisions in there on labor and the environment, and we are seeing, again, remains to be seen how it will come out, but we're seeing a first real challenge. The United States has brought a case against Guatemala. It's being litigated in front of a panel today, and I think importantly to keep your eyes on in terms of whether or not these disciplines that are in our current trade agreement work is to look at how does that case come out. Again, two real big issues arising in that case. I mean, the first one is this issue of can you actually prove that there has been a systemic violation of Guatemala's law such that you can bring a successful challenge? Because again, I think the perspective of the progressives all along has been it's maybe okay to say that we're going to bind people to be in conformance with their own domestic law, because that presumes that Guatemala has a labor law and that you can, in fact, prove that there have been systemic violations of Guatemala's labor law. So this is a test case. I mean, we have brought a case that says, yes, Guatemala does have domestic laws, and yes, we believe there have been systemic violations. The second important piece of that case is a requirement that you have to be able to prove that the violations of the trade laws caused trade effects in the United States or caused trade effects to all of the DR-CAFTA parties. And here again, the United States has put forward what looks to me to be very compelling evidence that you can show, but for these labor violations, there would have been stronger labor union fighters in Guatemala that would have been able to produce sort of better wages that would have changed the sort of cost structure such that you can show that, yes, in fact, Guatemala's systemic violation of its labor laws has caused trade effects in the United States. So again, just to keep an eye on, but my view is I'm not sure we need to go back and redo how we think about labor within the context of trade agreements when we already are beginning in all of the sort of next generation, everything since the May 10 Accords, we have these provisions within the agreements. I think we need to make sure that they are working. Third, I won't comment at great length on currency manipulation, given that Dan, I think, has already well and truly addressed it. While I would certainly share the concern that you can wipe out all of the benefits of a trade agreement by the way in which you could manipulate your currency, my own sense is that the real problem has been in both the IMF and at the WTO in terms of How we think about currency is at some level, it stems from a standard that says that in order to bring a currency manipulation case, you have to prove intent on the part of the government to manipulate their currency in order to gain an unfair trade advantage. And I think it's that point that's been really difficult for governments to get their arms around about whether they want to accuse another government of this intent, this malicious intent, if you will, to distort their currency for a trade manipulating purpose. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why our Treasury Department has generally not been willing to go there, and it's why the IMF in its entire existence has never found there to be a breach of the Articles of Agreement of the IMF is because of this. So again, I would say across a lot of these issues, I would agree that these are serious problems that are being very appropriately raised with our trading partners. The other sort of big with our trade policies, the other disagreement I guess I would have is with Dr. Bernstein's lists of what should be out of trade agreements. I mean, you all saw that list go up there: ISDS, constraints on food and safety, patents, limits on financial regulations, and process changes. This list of we should not have these in our trade agreements. I'm not sure I'm disagreeing because I think it's essential that each of those actually be in agreements, but I'm not sure they're either as problematic or as really important to any of these trade agreements as it sounds if you just sort of read through that list. And part of it is also, if you were to take them out of our trade agreements, then what? I mean, let's just pick ISDS. I mean, we hear loud and clear a lot of the complaints about ISDS, but let's remember that in every bit that the United States has, in every bit that Germany has, in every bit that every other country has, there is ISDS language, and much of it very rudimentary ISDS language, certainly not, as if you will, pro-progressive ISDS language is what you're seeing in TPP or any of the other agreements. So if you simply say, I don't want ISDS in this trade agreement, are you nonetheless leaving in place much older, much worse, if you will, ISDS language in every bit that would still remain? So not clear to me that again, that this list of what should be out would remain. And then I guess the final point I would make in commenting is I think there's a couple of, at least to me, the more serious faults of our trade policy and or our trade agreements that are not addressed in what Dr. Bernstein said. And the one that I would highlight first and foremost is the lack of effective disciplines on subsidies. I mean, to me, this is sort of the, if you will, one of the absolute number one problems with our trading system and our trading policies is that we have simply been unable to get our arms around very substantial disciplines on the use of subsidies. And I think a lot of the difficulties that we're seeing in terms of the growth of China in steel, aluminum, in chemicals, and all of these raw materials stems from this inability to effectively discipline subsidies. We don't have any subsidies disciplines anywhere on subsidies for services. So you start thinking about the fact there's no discipline whatsoever on services. The discipline that exists on goods exists only in the form of countervailing duties, which are only helpful if the imports are coming into your market. They're not helping you discipline subsidies more generally out in the rest of the world. So on that score, I think there's some missed things. Other last comments, a couple missed things to me is how we're dealing with the changes brought about by technology. I mean, this presumption that it's trade that caused all of the job losses as opposed to sort of the changes in technology and to some degree some of the changes within our corporate governance structures that are not perhaps included within that. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
I want to start by also congratulating Jared and Lori, with whom I've also co-authored, and applauding their paper. They recognize that globalization will surely proceed apace, their words. They provide a specific blueprint, practical proposals for us to talk about that can be a basis for a practical policy debate, and that's all to the good. And I agree that we can significantly improve the template that we now use to negotiate FTAs. So in broad, that's agreed. But I want to challenge the two basic premises that I think underlie their proposals, one of which is analytical and one of which is policy. On the analysis, The traditional analysis of trade and trade agreements reaches two basic conclusions. One is that liberalization produces large net gains for the United States. That's comprised of even larger gross gains offset by modest gross losses. The second conclusion is that the vast majority of the population gains from lower prices, from increased consumer choice, from improved productivity, most of those gainers by small amounts. But the vast majority of the population gains, at a small number of the population loses by bigger amounts because the shock to them is greater. But in terms of the comparison, winners and losers, the winners are far ahead, both in quantitative terms, in aggregate dollar amounts, and in terms of the number of people. Many examples from our work show that. Gary Huffbauer a decade ago showed that the U.S. economy was $1 trillion a year richer as a result of all the trade expansion of the previous half century. He generously acknowledged there were maybe $50 billion of annual losses, a benefit-to-cost ratio of 20 to 1. And that was from liberalization as well as technology improvement. Gary also found that there were available another $500 billion of gains from liberalization, not tinkering with the rules, but liberalization, reductions of barriers, big further gains, of which Peter Petrie, an analysis we released earlier this year, showed that the TPP would gain us over $100 billion of annual additional benefits. Robert Lawrence did a very detailed analysis for us of the cost side, concluded that maybe 50 to 100,000 jobs per year might be displaced out of a total labor force of 140 million and monthly job churn of 4 million. Again, a benefit-cost ratio close to 20 to 1. And so those are the analyses that have underlain traditional thinking about trade. Otter, Dorn, and Hansen say there was a China shock. Indeed, there was a China shock. But Otter, Dorn, and Hansen go on to say it was one shot, it's over, there's nobody else out there that could replicate that, and they support TPP. So it's hard to say that that ought to change the basic way of thinking about trade policy. Now, Jared and Laurie acknowledge the gains, but they seem to be challenging the received wisdom that the net effects are very positive. Why do I say that? Well, I quote two passages from their first few paragraphs. They talk about changing the substantive rules so that they will represent the needs of the majority, implying that the majority's needs are not now met by trade policy or trade agreements. They suggest that we should offer the increasingly large portion of the population who find themselves on the losing side something different. Again, the implication underlying their analysis that somehow the traditional conclusions are incorrect. But there's no evidence of that. They haven't provided the evidence. Nobody has provided the evidence. And until somebody does provide that evidence, I'm going to find it hard to disagree with the traditional analytical foundations established over so many years by so many people with such clarity that trade on balance and trade agreements on balance benefit the vast majority of the people, both in terms of numbers and in terms of aggregate amounts. Now, turning to policy, even if you buy their analysis that there's a problem for a large percentage of the country, I find it hard to believe that their policy proposals would do very much about it. And indeed, I think their notions for tinkering with the trade agreements, at best, it has to be marginal. What are the main problems with trade that are causing political angst in the country and providing support for Trump and Sanders? Well, it's not ISDS. It's job loss risks, lower wages, worry about inequality. But none of the proposals that Jared put up on the board, with the possible exception of one that I come to at the end, really would have anything at all to do with that. Instead, I would have thought that the way to go is to deal with domestic policies that can effectively address wage loss, job insecurity, and the need for worker training. There's a whole long list of policies that one could propose and pursue in that respect. Jared and Lori know them well, and they come under the heading of domestic safety nets and real adjustment programs. Wage insurance, much more generous than in the pilot program so far. Big improvements in unemployment insurance, where only 1/3 of the unemployed even get it, and when they do, they only get 1/3 of what they earned before. Further improvements in Obamacare, divorcing health insurance from job increases the mobility of the workforce and reduces the risk of losing a job due to trade or any other dynamic economic change. Significant increases in the minimum wage, much more generous earned income tax credits, serious worker training and lifetime employment programs. Now, Jared and Lori rightly say that those things have been promised in the past and not done. But I think the answer is not to throw out the trade program with all the benefits that I suggest it continues to provide, but rather to get serious about those programs. Presumably, President Clinton would want to do that anyway. But if she does, then it would add to the defenses against the losses of the big gains from trade that we can otherwise achieve. So it seems to me at the analytical level and at the policy level, there really is a need for a new path, but it's a different path from that has been suggested to us today. Finally, all this does not say that we cannot improve the trade agreement template. Here, of course, I especially agree with Jared and Lori, or maybe they agree with me, on the problem of currency manipulation. That is a big cause of U.S. economic losses. It was for a while. It's in remission now. As Dan said, the last couple of years, there's not much manipulation. China's on the other side of the market. So right now, manipulation is in remission. Nevertheless, Joe Gagnon and I have a book about to come out on it. I'm not going to discuss it much in detail today, only to say, in response to the proposal by Jared and Lori, that it would be good, in my view, to add currency provisions to trade agreements. Be very logical, should be doable, the same way labor and environment have come into trade agreements over the years. But again, as with safety nets and with worker adjustment, we can do much better by adding to our own domestic policy arsenal. If the U.S. would adopt one simple measure, what I call countervailing currency intervention, it would deal with the problem. If we told the Japanese that every time they bought $1 billion worth of dollars to keep the yen weak and the dollar strong, we would buy an offsetting $1 billion worth of yen to neutralize that effect, it would deter the whole practice because then it would have no impact. It would defend our rights, and we don't have to go out and negotiate it with the rest of the world. We should just do it. The Nike approach, just do it. So if we put in place countervailing currency intervention and did serious work on the safety nets and the labor training programs, then I think we have a program which would respond to the real concerns which are generated by trade. We could further improve the trade agreements in the future along their lines if those are debated out and found to be practicable. But I think to deal with the real problems, the ones that have surfaced so much in this political campaign, an approach of changing domestic policy, reiterating the traditional verities that trade as a whole benefits almost all Americans with very large amounts of money is the right way to go. Thank you.
Thank you all for holding this event. So my main mission is to comment on the commenters, but I just want to start with an overview of situating the paper, which is that the next president is going to have to create a new approach to trade. And even if you do not like the proposals that we are laying out, and are not altogether convinced that we have a big problem with our current trade rules, if you're not convinced, where the public is at this point means the status quo model isn't politically viable as is. And as somebody who does not want to see global trade collapse and sees the upsides of trade as compared to a lot of what's in our trade agreements, I think it is a fairly dire warning to folks who in this town have been strong advocates for our past trade agreement model to recognize the political reality of where we are. And that's not going to be possible to just talk people down in a way, educate them out of their thinking, that there really has been a shift that needs some kind of redress. The other piece of that was to say that the people who think of this election as a fluke and things are going to go back to normal afterwards, I think that's also a dangerous mistake for the cause of trade expansion. Because if you look at the polling, the trending in the polling, and you look at the trade votes, the votes are getting tighter, the polling was getting more mixed, but the thing that we've seen now is the elevation of the issue has now exposed a lot more people to the details of aspects of the agreements that aggravate people enormously. And so what the polling has showed consistently is that a lot of people have no clue, for instance, what TPP was, until they had both Sanders and Trump and then Clinton talking about it all the time. And now as a result, as awareness has gone up, so has opposition. And that is a reality, and that does not go back into the box. So given that, how do we separate out the cause of trade expansion, which has real benefits, with some of the stuff that's ended up in our trade agreements that is now weighing down the cause of trade expansion? And the theme of our paper, basically, is that trade agreements should be for expanding trade. Yay! And that we should get rid of some of the other baggage. And effectively, our analysis is one of corporate capture. So the current regime of trade negotiations that was set in 1974, tweaked, but basically Nixon's fast track with the trade advisory committees, is simply incongruent with the reality of what is now in today's trade agreements. So we had an advisory committee system premised on sort of the notion of the Tokyo round, which is we're going to negotiate about tariff cuts on goods. Nothing we can't drop on our foot is going to be in a trade agreement. It's about goods. And over time, a closed system that privileged particular commercial interests resulted in what's effectively the hijack of trade agreements to have the good name of free trade weighed down with all this other stuff unrelated to trade, some of which is sort of classic rent-seeking protectionist, a particular industry got a particular thing, and that's now a trade agreement chapter. And I have this vision of Adam Smith and David Ricardo rolling in their graves to look at some of the chapters that are now in free trade agreements. That's the policy point. There's also the political point. You get rid of people like me in this debate if you get back to trade. Now, that's not 100% true, because I want the trade rules to be right, too. But how did public citizen, the environmental groups, the human rights groups, the LGBT groups, all of these groups that didn't really intend to get into trade, get into the trade fight? It's because trade got into our business, starting with NAFTA, when the boundaries of past trade agreements, which are about tariff liberalization, displaying subsidies, customs rules, were exploded, and all this other stuff, through this industry capture, got superglued into the agreements. So our basic premise here is take the non-trade stuff out. There may be reasons to have international rules on intellectual property. That's called WIPO. That fight should be happening in an agency that isn't cross-sanctioning our actual trade relations. There are references that can be made in a trade agreement to WIPO, like the WTO does, but our point is don't add new monopoly protections in a free trade agreement de novo in the name of trade liberalization, and then get the rules right on trade. Now, generally, to shift, because Jared did such a great job explaining the paper, to shift to some of the responses, I'm generally not going to touch on economics, because that would be malpractice. I'm not an economist. That's Jared's gig. That's why we're a team. However, the one thing I would say is just I'm going to take Fred up on his challenge about show me one point where anyone has said that the problems we're raising are not actually being caused by the agreements, and that trade has just created net gains for everyone. And we all know the basic premise. The gains are on the import side. All consumers benefit from lower prices, but some workers could get hurt. We should help the workers that get hurt. If everyone has not read it, and this paper scared the hell out of me because it's full of high-level calculus, Google for Professor Samuelson's, one of his last papers, where Ricardo and Mill rebut and confirm agreements, Journal of Economic Perspectives, 2004, where he does the math that basically shows as offshoring has moved up the income level and it's no longer just low-wage jobs, you actually can net out negatively mathematically in his own formula from more liberalization, because the loss of wages across the economy actually outweighs the gains in cheaper goods on the import side. And he does his own math. Now, and it's lots of math, it's pages of math. However, a more civilian, lawyer-friendly version of that is a study that the Center for Economic Policy and Research did, where they applied more of the actual data in the US, looking at consumer prices, looking at wages, trying to use actually one of the Peterson Institute papers to try and figure out the percentage of influence of greater inequality caused by trade, the 39% paper, as compared to other reasons for downward pressure, using the higher, they thought it was a higher number, but using your number to do the 39%, then did the math, what was the net, and they found that at the median income, people were net losing $3,000, basically more or less their tax burden, federal tax burden, because of the wash of greater losses in wages than gains for cheaper goods. So with that on the side, I wanted to dive into some of the specific things that Dan and Jennifer said, which is, one other thing just on the Fred point, which is, again, just in the politics, where are people really upset about ISDS or is the inequality? Well, I think the trade agreements actually, there's a whole body of studies about this, are contributing to inequality. But actually, the polling and focus group shows the thing that has people's hair on fire about trade right now is not the stuff all of us trade wonks are thinking about, like rules of origin. It's the notion of these agreements as captured by companies, so corporate capture, rigged rules, and investor state actually in focus groups and polling comes out as the thing on a transpartisan basis that makes people the most unhinged. Which for strong free traders, you take a demographic that's West Coast, college-educated, professionally employed, et cetera. You look for the strongest crosstab that is for these agreements in general, and ISDS makes them nuts. So just as a political matter, I say among colleagues, that is something for the sake of passing trade agreements that would be wise to jettison. So on to some of the things that Dan mentioned. So we're not actually calling for a double standard in people's rights to determine their own futures. What we're calling for is basically using the standards that sovereign nations have agreed to. The International Labor Organization standards, the multilateral environmental agreement standards. Now, I'm sure if I had a magic wand, I could create a standard that may be stronger than that and more immediately pleasing for raising wages, but it's not my right. Sovereign nations have negotiated and agreed as their sovereign to sign on to those standards. But the problem is a practical one of sequencing, which is right now, those aren't very enforceable. The trade agreements are, and in fact, if you take an action ostensibly to implement one of your other treaty obligations, absent a savings clause, you're in violation. That's the point that you and I wrote about in part, with why we need to actually get a set of rules about how climate rules relate to trade agreements versus letting it be done in the Wild West of dispute resolution. What we're talking about is sequencing the enforcement. So one of the things we talk about is using the very enticing access to our market as a way for countries, the elite in countries and the governments, to have incentives to improve environmental, labor, human rights standards, serve along the readiness criteria that the European Union uses to figure out who new entrants would be, which is you set some rules, you have countries aspire to our privileged market access and to have incentives to improve their standards. And you only let countries join once you actually have seen the changes, as compared to hoping down the road Vietnam is going to have independent labor unions and somehow, the current sequencing is a problem. As far as secrecy, the text didn't show up until 30 days after the agreement was initialed. It was locked. The point is, for our proposals, if we're going to build support broadly, then we need Congress, the public, to have the ability to see what the negotiators are doing in our name at the point where actually there's an opportunity to have a course correction. So the increased transparency actually in the long run is going to build support. And the stuff that can't survive the Dracula test, the stuff that in the sunshine, that should not be in a trade agreement, because we're going to end up with the kind of food fight we have right now with TPP, where there isn't a majority in the House of Representatives because they're knockdown, drag-out fights over things, in part, that no one knew were going to pop up in there, some of which could have come out along the way and avoided the total political disaster. As far as the sort of notion that we keep moving the ball with demands, actually, I just want to point out the demands have been remarkably consistent. Joint House Resolution HCon Res 246, 1992, Gephardt and Waxman, laying out what, as NAFTA was being finished, ought to be in a good trade agreement. The Trade Act, Trade Reform, Accountability, Development, and Employment Act of 2009, 85 pages of specific language that more or less spells out the kinds of what goes in and what goes out that we've been discussing. The problem with TPP is it actually rolls back, say, the environmental standards Bush had in his last agreements. How did it come to pass that all those environmental groups the White House was saying would support TPP, Defenders of Wildlife, National Resources Defense Council, came out against? Because it doesn't even actually measure up to the old standard. And this gets to an issue Jennifer brought up, which is the Guatemala case. So that case is actually under the old rules. That's under the CAFTA rules. That's pre-May 11th, May 10th. And that set of rules is enforce your own laws, and that did not work. The new rules since the Peru agreement under Bush are you have to meet ILO, not conventions though, but declaration rules. And it's not the actual ILO conventions. So in the case of Guatemala, that case has been going on for 8 years. 8 years since it was originally filed, and there's been no enforcement. And Guatemala basically never changed its practices from before its obligations in CAFTA to after its obligations in CAFTA. And there have been, through 2 administrations, basically, because it started at the very end of Bush, an attempt to get enforcement. That case is actually one of the reasons that's fostering the demand for better enforcement. So I look forward to all of our discussions going forward. I think in the group, I think one of the things to think about with ISDS and the sort of political imperative of getting it out of our agreements is the question of that Jennifer had of what comes next. And I think absent an orderly way of dealing with ISDS, we're going to see more major countries just withdraw. So far, South Africa, India, Indonesia, and a bunch of South American countries have given notice just to dump their ISDS agreements. And I think an approach forward is an overarching treaty that could be passed to actually affect all of those that are now in effect. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lori. If I could ask all 5 of our speakers to come up to the table, and thanks to all of them for sticking through their time while being so substantive and forthright. I think this made for a great discussion with many dimensions. I don't want this, though, to become a debate. We've seen on television lately things called debates don't go very well if you care about substance. So what I'd like to do is open it up to the floor. As usual, we have a standing mic in back to which you can go and a traveling mic up front. When I recognize you, please identify yourself and please try to keep your question brief so that our panelists can respond. Please.
Okay. I'm Deborah Miller, and this question reflects me in my capacity over at George Mason University as an adjunct professor. Those presentations were all very, very interesting. Thank you. This is a difficult topic, and I think that the politics of the moment have been reflected in your remarks, so I'm really grateful for that, and I think there's some great economic thinking here. I want to mention something that has to do with history, and that has to do with WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and the ILO. And so the suggestion is made, let's keep intellectual property rights out of trade agreements. Let's keep labor standards out of trade agreements. And as a student of those 2 international organizations, I can only say historically, regarding the ILO, The United States, for many, many years, 50, 75 years, if things have changed, please tell me, didn't sign the conventions of the ILO. It wasn't prepared to...
I'm sorry, could we get this to a question,
Yes,
please?
to enforce them. Will things change with the ILO? The Soviet Union signed them, but compliance was something that the ILO also didn't do. The second thing is regarding WIPO. That was a fairly...
Please state this as a question.
Will WIPO, thank you. Will WIPO, which also isn't an enforcement organization really, do the same thing? Thanks so much.
Okay. Who would like to respond? Anybody?
Should we take a couple of questions and then?
No, we'll do it one at a time, and then people can respond.
Well, I think, Laura, you should respond. But one quick point is that we don't suggest that labor standards should come out. We think they should be contingent on a sequencing, as we said, and that the enforcement should be a much higher level preference in the agreements.
And as far as what does or does not belong in the trade agreement, our basic premise is our trade agreement should focus on trade. So standards that directly affect the price factors in trade should be included. And basically this gets to Jennifer's very astute comment on subsidies, which actually, as I'm thinking back, we should have said more about subsidies and SOEs perhaps in our paper, because that really is an honest-to-God trade distorting problem that we touch on with rules of origin and other distortions, but perhaps do not dig deeply enough into when thinking about, after excising the baggage, how to fix the trade part.
All right, Fred?
The questioner indicated why these issues have come into the WTO. It's because the WTO has enforcement mechanisms. So everybody with an interest, be it labor standards, environmental standards, now currency, wants her or his issue in the WTO because it's got enforcement mechanisms. That then sets up a tension because, as has been said in the discussion today, those are not the traditional trade issues, but they've been dragged in because the institutions that were set up to handle them don't do anything about it, including, incidentally, the IMF on currency. So everything gravitates to the WTO. It overloads the WTO system. It leads to the kind of criticisms we have today. But what I don't quite understand is why Lori says, on the one hand, keep all that stuff out of the WTO, put it back in WIPO, when we know WIPO doesn't have any enforcement tools. So, Lori, how do you resolve your dilemma?
I think that folks who are in the world of intellectual property and want to see stronger enforcement in that agency can have a debate within that agency about how it operates, to the extent that price factors in trade are represented by various international standards like labor, like toxics, like pollution control, which directly go towards what the value of a good in international trade will be. It's appropriate, as the original ITO, International Trade Organization, did, to link to those agencies, the ITO, the thing that was before the WTO, which the US Senate tanked, right when the GATT was created after World War II, had links to the ILO because it had to do with production costs. I think that is the standard, as compared to caboosing something, protections for a particular kind of property unrelated to trade. I mean, my joke for years has been the chapters in WTO that don't have anything to do with trade are all prefaced by the phrase trade-related intellectual property standards, because someone looking at the actual text would say, why is there rent-seeking monopoly protections in a trade agreement? If it needs to have trade-related in front of it, it shouldn't be in the agreement.
Yep, Dan?
Quick point. One, I think the impact of domestic labor and environmental laws on trade is exaggerated. I don't think nations can gain some sort of long-term advantage. And secondly, what raises those standards? It's not the rich countries waving a billy club telling poor countries to raise their standards. It's a rising standard of living in those countries, propelled in part by trade. And study after study shows that as incomes rise, people demand better labor standards, better environmental standards. The best thing we can do if we want to raise labor and environmental standards around the world, for our sake and for the sake of other people, is to trade with them, buy their products, see their incomes rise, see their standards rise.
Okay, the next question, please. And then in front here, Jessica.
Bob Vastine, Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. Thank you. Dr. Griswold, what proportion of unemployment is actually caused by trade? Secondly, Dr. Bernstein, I think it's really become fashionable and unfair to label TAA in such a way, burial insurance. In fact, the Labor Department says that 46,000 people were aided by, individuals were aided by TAA last year. Now, that doesn't mean it meets the need. The law is flawed. They're operating under 4 different statutes. There's not enough money, but it's what we've got. And maybe we could improve it, along with adding some of the ideas that Fred has mentioned, wage insurance and earned income benefits.
Okay.
So those are great points, and I very much stipulate to what you said. I probably inelegantly was trying to say that if you actually go out, as I have, to the Rust Belt and talk to people about TAA, that's their response. I take your point. Wait, I wouldn't shrug my shoulders and say that doesn't matter. That's precisely what we're talking about today. Oh, okay, sorry. It's precisely that kind of conception that is motivating our work, but your point is very well taken, and I also very much appreciate the connection you made to all the great points Fred made about an actual improvements in the safety net that could really make a difference. I think TAA remains a very incomplete safety net for people who have lost high value-added jobs. I will say that in my day job at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, I work on that stuff about 90% of my waking hours. So don't think because we're talking about this stuff today that those safety net issues are immaterial to me.
Just to respond first, so I'm not accused of malpractice. I'm not a doctor. I have a lowly master's degree. But about trade and unemployment. First, I think in the longer run, trade isn't about more jobs or fewer jobs. It's about better jobs. So I think the impact on the overall unemployment rate is pretty much zero. In terms of the job turnover, been various studies, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 3% of job displacement in the United States has to do with trade. The other 97% is technology, it's changing consumer tastes, which goes to, I think, a point of consensus that you're seeing is that we need to do more in terms of crafting the right policies to help people adjust to the jobs being created, job retraining, better unemployment, I think more labor mobility. I like the idea of divorcing insurance and pensions from a particular job. You know, the bottom line is we need to help our fellow citizens prepare for the jobs being created today and tomorrow, not bring back the jobs from some romanticized past that wasn't all that great.
Okay, Jennifer?
I only had one little data point, just because you raised questions about it, is the OECD obviously studies and, sort of interesting data to think about how much public spending there is on active labor market programs, meaning the panoply of job training, et cetera. And I think there it's very clear that the United States ranks at the absolute bottom of the OECD numbers. I mean, if you look at, we're at something like 0.3% of public spending on again, active labor market programs as compared to, Spain that's over 3%, Denmark at 3%, et cetera. So on the sort of broader picture of are we spending enough in terms of long-term training and other help for our workers, the answer I think is an unequivocal no. But my own point would be it shouldn't all be laid at the feet of trade adjustment assistance. I mean, it should be, again, available for everybody. And I will say the backlog of cases at the Court of International Trade for people to prove that their job was lost to trade as opposed to lost to technology or something else is sort of absurd as a waste of money. In other words, you only get adjustment assistance if you can prove get in the queue at the CIT to prove that your job was lost to trade. To me, makes no sense. We ought to be opening it up to anybody that lost their job and wants to be retrained for a better one. And we ought to shift this dynamic in terms of the overall percentage that this country is willing to invest in active labor market programs. We need to be better on that scale.
I can't resist saying that I am very heartened that this, in a sense, is one of the emerging points of consensus from today's discussion. I think that's where a lot of us are and where Jared knows I am personally. And from an economist's point of view, obviously, the arbitrariness, however you decide what's a trade-related job versus a technology-related job loss, and the unfairness of saying certain people have certain types of access as opposed to all citizens, I think is very evident. So if that, in addition to all the other good ideas come out of here today, if we have a somewhat united front that the U.S. has failed its workers, full stop, I think that would be a good starting point.
Look, let me just say quickly, Adam, that's a great point. I just want to add, because we're having these fiscal discussions, that we're not going to be able to accomplish even a small percentage of those goals unless we start to see budgets that rely far less on lots of tax cuts and more on revenues.
Yes. Out in front here, and then we'll go to the back mic.
Thanks, Adam. Kim Elliott with the Center for Global Development. And Jared mentioned briefly Danny's piece in the Times a few weeks ago. And I kind of wish he'd been on this panel, because I think what we're not discussing is democracy and the role of democracy in what is the appropriate scope of trade agreements. And so I would agree with a lot of the things, actually, that were on Jared and Lori's out list. But I also think labor and environment are mostly about, country's own situation and what's happening with their workers and their environment. Many environmental spillovers are local and not international. And so I think paring back in those areas as well, that we should really do what Lori said, which is really return to let's focus on trade and what are the barriers to trade. And I think the way to make this politically viable, because we're just going to fight. And why are we going to have to fight? How are we going to regulate the global economy by institutions that are not democratic? And I think that was the core of Danny's point. So so we should be leaving more to society and dealing with the actual trade-related spillovers where they occur. So a much narrower approach, not to leave labor and environment out entirely, but just like IP, it should be a much narrower trade-related. If there are spillovers, sort of akin to Danny's idea of social clause. So it seems to me that's the only way we're going to have any chance at all, along with the labor side, adjustment program, safety net, and so forth that deal with the effects of trade.
Since Kim, who knows better, didn't ask a question, I'm going to move to the back.
I would just want to know if anybody would,
No,
I strongly agree. It's exactly where Danny's coming from, and I commend his paper to that. And Danny argues that the bigger worry today is that unmanaged globalization is undermining democracy, and I think that's a kind of a profound point.
And I for the record, democracy is not just defined by pandering to whatever is unpopular or popular. Democracy is also defined by certain processes and certain rights. And so I actually completely disagree with Danny's article. I think it's a shallow pandering to some very bad politics. That there's a difference between saying that they have to be taken seriously and that they're inherently legitimate. As a veteran of the Brexit war, I know that the vast bulk of people who voted for Brexit voted for racist, xenophobic reasons. And, legally that's their right. But the pretense that that doesn't collide with other aspects of democracy and rule of law is wrong. So I just don't
In
buy
defense
Danny.
of Danny, who is not an associate, I know him by reading his papers, his trilemma paper, which lays out this basic problem, predates when it was popular to be concerned about responding to the political moment.
Thanks to Fred, we published Danny's Has Globalization Gone Too Far before he was even known. So we're well aware of Danny's arguments. His most recent stuff I do not find convincing. At the back, please.
Yeah, hi, Colin Hendricks here at the Institute. And I'm asking this question as somebody who grew up in the 80s. We didn't talk at all today about sort of the regional mismatches between the winners and losers that have been created by increased trade exposure in the United States. Could you talk a little bit how the clustering of some of the pain and then the clustering of some of the benefits, maybe on the coast, and then clustering of pain in the Rust Belt, how that complicates policy interventions and the politics around those policy interventions in trying to get or move the ball forward on a new compact on trade? Thank you.
You express the challenge very eloquently, and it is very much in play right now. And, to me, without your question demands a much longer answer than I have time for, but it does come back to a couple of things and disagreements I have with Fred. While it may well be the case that the net benefits of trade are positive, I would certainly dissociate trade and trade agreements in this regard. And I think trade agreements have been particularly tough. This comes out of Order et al., but it also comes out of Bivens' work, which finds that, in fact, for the vast majority of non-college educated workers, which are still 2/3 of the workforce, they've taken a negative hit. Lori cites some of the same things, but it's much more concentrated in precisely the communities you reference. And in fact, I'm not sure how accurate these indices are, but indices of the relative paths of different geographies now show that, in fact, what you're describing is getting worse, not better. There's a very nice paper by a guy out at Berkeley whose name I'm blocking on right now, Nate something, on this point. And so I think that the solutions must be geographically specific. We have to find ways not only to get some of the safety net kinds of ideas that Fred was talking about to places where the pain is most pronounced, but issues of raising the minimum wage, creating more opportunities, investments. I mean, Hillary Clinton actually manufacturing communities that have been hit by precisely these dynamics, including a $10 billion plan to see if these manufacturing hubs can actually play off and make a play for advanced manufacturing often with a green with investment in green tech. So that's a short answer to a long question, a good tough question.
Would anybody else like to go in? Jennifer?
I'll only
Lori?
add that you see this also in how this plays out in the sort of Republican, Democrat, who's a free trader or a protectionist, et cetera. If you look at the most recent data out of, for example, the Pew Charitable Trust's polling data, sort of interestingly to me to look at those numbers, and what you see now is that the majority of Republicans are protectionist, anti-trade, and the majority of Democrats, I do have that right, the majority of Democrats are far more pro-trade. And when you then ask why is that, since it sort of goes against a lot of people's urban myths and everything else and their actual historical past, why? Because of who trade is perceived as hurting. Because if you then look at the data, what it shows is the people that are the most against trade are, to put it very perhaps not correct, the old white men. I mean, so they poll by gender, by age, and by region. And so what you see is the old white men in the Midwest are vehemently against trade and are now vehemently pro-Trump and Republican. And a lot of that is because of exactly these issues, that their life has not worked out how they thought. I mean, they grew up where their fathers could make enough money to support the family, and now they have themselves and their wife working full-time, and they're not able to adequately support their children. And so for them, trade and the global economy and globalization has not worked out. So I think you see it both in the more real numbers that Jared Bernstein is citing, but I think you clearly see it in the political numbers that would come out of the polling data as well.
Lori?
I think an interesting thing for some of the economists in the room to think about is also looking at the data of the trends, both regionally but sectorally, that the Trade Adjustment Assistance database provides. Because what's interesting, I mean, I've looked at it, but not ever done a formula to figure out distributionally over time the sectors and the regions of certifications. And it's a really under sample of the actual trade job loss, because not only do you have to get certified, but up until 2002, it didn't cover any service sector work. So like the service sector part of a car plant that shut down, relocated, the whole thing went to Mexico since NAFTA, couldn't be covered. But what the sample does show you is right in the beginning of NAFTA, a lot of the Midwest jobs went. But now the biggest numbers are actually in high-end, high-wage areas. And it's also part of the coast, which is not what you'd expect, given Jennifer's right about where the polling shows. So you have aerospace on the West Coast. You've got a lot of jobs in Texas and also in the East Coast relating to high-tech jobs. They're the ones now being certified. So I think it would just be very interesting, because it goes to the question Kim pointed out, but others, about the overall effects of having of the agreements on inequality, et cetera. You can't compensate your way out of a trade policy if it's causing broad net losses. So to the extent the offshoring is moving up in the pay scale, what are the policy parts? And this is the economics twist I would love someone to tell me the answer for. The data show our exports to our FTA partners, the growth rate is 29% lower than the countries we don't have FTAs with. Totally counterintuitive, right? We get rid of all tariffs, but the growth rate of exports is lower. And I have always wondered if that has to do with the thing that the Cato Institute once pointed out, which is how the investment rules lower the risk burden of offshoring. Are we now incentivizing companies to make the stuff there and send it here, so we both have fewer exports and now have more imports? And I'm wondering if we can put together the TAA databases, but also that export growth data to try and figure out some quant person out there. Because getting the policy right is going to be key for who gets compensated and what regions of the country think they're winners and losers.
Okay, Fred?
On this question of trade and inequality, I think it's really worth underlining something Dan said, which is that the biggest winners from trade agreements and trade expansion are the lowest income groups. The biggest winners are the lower income groups. He pointed out, and our studies have shown that too, that the fact that imports are a much bigger share of the market basket of low-income folks means that they're the big winners from opening markets. But even more surprising, Mark Nolan recently did a study for us here, some of you were here when we released it a few weeks ago, on Trump economics. Suppose Trump's protectionist proposals went into effect. Who would be the biggest losers? Who would lose jobs? Well, the fascinating and surprising answer was retail workers, the employees at Walmart, low-income folks. Why? Because the people that they sell to, the people that they cater to, would lose lots of jobs, and the pass-through to retail would be huge. So they would be the biggest losers. Now, I'm sure they don't know it, but that's the fact. And if we think seriously about the distributional effects of trade, we better keep in mind that we would be hurting the poorest people if we fail to liberalize further.
So I have to point. The whole point of this exercise, it's gotten a little bit lost in the discussion. The whole point of this exercise by Lori and I is that given the unsustainability of the current status quo,
that's what my question is about, by the way.
Oh, good. If you want trade liberalization to proceed apace, we think you have to deal with the challenges we raise. You have a question, so I want to get.
Yeah, and this will be the last question.
Longtime trade reporter, and I had a question about actually liberalizing something related to trade, because I thought, quite frankly, that Dan Griswold kind of flopped the challenge of providing what Jared seemed to want some fresh air in this debate about what should be included in a trade agreement. And here, let me throw out something for you, which is legal services, ridiculously expensive in this country. And there's all sorts of things that could be done. Germany uses notaries for a lot of simple legal services. You could imagine telelegal services, all sorts of interesting things. A great libertarian argument, because it would prove your cred as a free trader. And those of you, on the other side of this debate might also, get a way to sort of chip away at what you call the corporate capture of trade policy. Now, don't be totally surprised.
Can we get it to a
here's
question?
The question, Adam, which is that on the heels of the Great Recession, where law firms compete on price, you introduce liberalization. Don't be surprised if lawyers start sounding like steel workers. But that's a real challenge. What can you do to liberalize the things that actually cost money in the society?
Yeah, while I'm sure probably everyone wants to get their licks in on this, I'll just say the single thing Dean Baker ever wrote that I most agree with was his calling out the hypocrisy of the protected professional classes in the U.S., like lawyers specifically. I think it's a great idea to think about. Please.
I was going to direct people to that paper. He goes through back of the envelope math of what would happen if you liberalized in lawyers, doctors, et cetera. It's a very good point.
I just want to say I'm all for it. And that's kind of what outsourcing is about. Remember all the worries 10 years ago about Indian radiologists looking at charts over in India? I think that'd be a great way to dampen costs. But let's just remind ourselves all the fears about outsourcing 10 years ago. People like Alan Blinder, who's written a lot of great stuff on trade, talking about whatever the figure was, 40 million jobs at risk. Somebody should revisit that. Those fears never came true. I think a lot of the fears we hear today are going to look as silly as that 10 years from now.
Jennifer, do you want to come in on this? You don't have to. Okay, Fred?
Nope.
Okay, Jared?
Well, I just want to, you criticize Dan's position, and I agree that, in many ways, Dan's presentation was kind of the poster child for keeping the status quo the way it is. But, in his defense, that's certainly not uncommon in this town. I think and maybe this is a useful sort of a summary kind of comment. What Lori and I are stressing here is that the type of status quo that Dan is defending won't stand. That if that's the way that you hope things will proceed, not only will you be disappointed, but I fear you'll undermine the drive to tap the benefits of globalization while trying to make the kinds of adjustments we suggest. But we might be wrong. We might come back here to IE a couple of years ago, and all this will have fizzled into the ether. And that's one of the reasons this debate is ongoing. I strongly don't believe that to be the case, however.
Why don't we end it there with thanks to Fred, to Jennifer, to Dan for engaging so forthrightly and clearly, but especially to Lori and Jared for giving us today, but more generally the public debate, a constructive way to think about moving globalization forward and not losing all the gains. Thank you all very much.